Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPA is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. So the last week was kind of turbulent for Europe. And frankly, if I were to put it like that, to use a boxing metaphor, it's disoriented like a pugilist floored with a jab, cross, and left hook, trying to get up before the count gets to 8. It began with Donald Trump picking up the phone and speaking to Vladimir Putin about ending the war in Ukraine. He then spoke with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky to tell him that he, as in Trump, had a meaningful discussion with Putin. There's no indication that there were any policy consultations with Zelensky or America's European/NATO allies. So classic Trump coming in, kicking the chessboard to start playing solitaire. The next day, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told the Ukraine Defense Contact Group that it was, as he put it, unrealistic to expect Ukraine to return to its pre-2014 borders or the prospect of it joining NATO. Any peacekeeping force following some agreement will be a non-NATO mission, and Europe will have to work out the security guarantees. So the message basically is, folks, no more tandem skydiving with the US instructor. Time to go solo. As if this wasn't enough, enter J.D. Vance, the US sweep. At the Munich Security Conference, instead of saying anything about Ukraine, which is what people were presumably expecting he would, Vance broke a cardinal rule of transatlantic relations. Politics stops at the water's edge. He launched a broadside at European democracies, specifically targeting what he called curbs on free speech, and also broadened the issue of immigration. That begot a reaction from German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, and others. But Vance wasn't done. Ignoring Scholz, he met with Alice Weidel, co-chairperson of AfD, the German far-right party, cocking a snook at the concept of what the Germans call the firewall. This was instructive and in line with what Elon Musk has been doing, not just in Germany, but across Europe, and what he has been accused of, promoting far-right populist parties across Europe. There was also criticism of Hegseth's and Vance's debut outings in the US, except one key listener, the boss, Trump. The corollary is that Musk, Hegseth, and Vance weren't playing off their own bats. They're acting on Trump's orders or worldview, if you will. To discuss these developments, I have a great panel. Marc Saxer is Asia Director of Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung and a specialist in strategy and forecasting. He regularly curates and convenes meetings and conferences on global security issues. He's also the author of Transformative Realism, How to Overcome the System Crisis. With him is Dr. Christopher Preble, a former US Navy officer. Preble is currently Senior Fellow and Director of the Reimagining US Grand Strategy program at the Stimson Center. He's the author of 4 books, including Peace, War, and Liberty, Understanding US Foreign Policy, and more. For our present purpose, a co-authored book, Fuel to the Fire, How Trump Made America's Broken Foreign Policy Even Worse, and How We Can Recover. This book came out in 2019. He also co-hosts the Net Assessment podcast in the War on the Rocks network. Thank you so much, gentlemen. As I said, last week was pretty turbulent. Let me begin with Marc here. Marc, I am somewhat surprised that Europe was surprised by what Hegseth said or that what Vance said. And you know why I'm surprised? Because this was on the cards, and this has been going on, throughout the campaign trail. And then since November last, when Trump won, he has been very clear about how he's going to go about this. So I'm not sure, is it that Europe wasn't listening? Is it about the fact that they thought that, what he said on the campaign trail is not going to translate into actual policy making, or the fact that the blob will be able to prevail upon Trump and kind of change his worldview? Why exactly, should I say, were the European leaders surprised?
Well, it's actually a pretty good question. Actually, I was so surprised that Europe is surprised. But I think in order to understand that, you have to dive into the psychology of European actors and leaders. And I think it's a classical case of, what it cannot be what must not be. I think looking into the abyss of what is actually happening right now has been so terrifying for European leaders because they're so ill prepared for what is happening right now that they just was basically trying to shy away from that and somehow hoping for the best. And I mean, this has been going on for a while. It's the second Trump administration. We had the same couple of questions already on the table. A couple of years ago, former Chancellor Angela Merkel famously said after a previous Munich security conference that we are on our own, guys, right? And then nothing happened, which seems to be pretty much the standard procedure in Europe these days. Nothing much is happening despite all the analysis. And I think that is some sort of the collective shock. Everyone is stunned by what happened, even though they shouldn't be. But I think it's really the realization what it means to be on their own, how ill prepared they are for what is actually out there in challenges right now, and how steep the mountain is that needed to be climbed right now.
Okay, so a quick follow-up before I go to Chris for his take on what exactly this inflection point means. Mark, are you surprised that there was such overt intervention? I mean, I'm not talking about Elon Musk. He doesn't hold an official position per se, if you count out the Doge part of it. But the US VP standing there and launching a broadside, not just at Germany, but the UK also, and more generally on European democracies, and then going and ignoring the sitting chancellor just a week or 5 days before the German elections, going and meeting with Alice Weidel. Is that something that surprised you?
Well, it seems to be pretty much in line the style of Donald Trump and his administration. Maybe we should call it like shock and awe. Just go in like as bombastic as you could possibly be, with like wild allegations and also demands, and then at the end of the day see if there is a deal to be made. If that's going to end the same way as it ended with Canada and Mexico, I think then we all can walk away somewhat unscarred. I just don't think that's going to happen. And I think that's the much more concerning part here, is that I think this one's going to be much more serious. Actually, quite interesting if you think about it. He starts like with these little things with Canada and Mexico. Then he goes to Europe, which we all expected. And China hasn't started yet, right? So there's a certain rhythm and a certain sequence where it seems to be ramping up for the big one.
Right. Chris, let's get your overview. I mentioned one of your books, To Our Present Purpose, right, which came out in 2019. So it was broken. Trump made it worse. And now Trump is back.
Right.
And this time, unlike the previous avatar, where he was new, mostly had people from the old hands, from the establishment, and of course Republicans, kind of right of the Republican Party, but very much part of the old sort of blob. Right. This time he has come in, he has fired 1,000 people who said will not be part of his administration, and he is doing things that are essentially far more disruptive than he could manage last time. And just to add, you will recall that last time when he did the Afghan policy review, and when he presented it, he started by saying that I normally go with my instinct, but this time I've listened to my generals, and we are going to do this review. Although later he talked about his generals as being idiots and all of that, but right, this time he knows DC, and this time he actually controls the Republican Party.
Yes.
And what used to be the Republican fringe is now the Republican mainstream in many ways. So how much worse can it get, to once again refer to your book's title?
Right. Well, it's always darkest before the dawn, and except for the real blackness. So things can get worse. First and foremost, I want to second what you both said, which is if the European leaders are in any way surprised by what is going on, shame on them, because they saw this coming. In fact, I wrote an article that was published by the German Marshall Fund actually in 2016, before he was elected president, saying if there was even a 1 in 3 chance that someone like Donald Trump could ever become president of the United States, that should cause a real reckoning. And that did not happen. It is clear that that did not happen in the first Trump term for some of the reasons, Ejaz, that you said, which is that there were people within his administration at fairly senior levels who when President Trump would say something, they would come up and clean up on aisle 7. They would come along and say, no, this is not what he meant. We're not changing our policy. There were still people in senior leadership positions within the Republican Party who disagreed with him. And I think we have to remember that President Trump is not a particularly assertive or determined person. He sort of tries things out, sees how they work out, and then moves on to the next thing. And he didn't have it in himself in the first administration to really fight all the time with all of his own folks. Eventually, he replaced them with people that he liked better. So there's some of what's going on now, as you've already anticipated, is there are still voices within the Republican Party who are saying to the Europeans, NATO is still an ironclad commitment, where nothing is going to change. But the Secretary of Defense is not saying that. The Secretary of State is not saying that. The Vice President is not saying that. And so we see, or we should see, that these assurances to the Europeans in particular that nothing is going to change, everything's going to be fine, nothing to worry about, those ring hollow. Okay, they should. And so we do see some movement, even just in the last 48 hours, by the way, in response to Hegseth and Vance's speeches, as well as other developments over the last week. We see European leaders getting together to try to get their act together, so to speak, to sort of align their messages. And here again, I say, well, better late than never. Why weren't you doing this a year ago? Why were you doing this 6 months ago? Part of the reason is because the Biden administration told them they had no need to do that everything was going to be fine. The United States is back. These commitments are ironclad. And so that, they were sort of waiting to see. Well, now I think the wait and see part is over. They have seen, it is apparent to them where the Trump administration's focus is and will be. And that means that European security is primarily a European project. And that's where things stand right now, today.
Right. I just want to go back. I mean, Mark has actually referred to this. And we know that Trump essentially deals as, the way he's been dealing as a real estate mogul. And there are so many things that, the book that he was basically written by Schwartz, The Art of the Deal, where he talks about some of those things. We also have this absolutely great book by the late Wayne Barrett, who was a Mark Raker journalist who wrote this book, which gives us a sense of what Trump really is in so many ways. Is it possible that, he starts maximalist, essentially setting the opening price, and then using the psychological anchoring effect of that price to begin to negotiate? I also have the sense, and correct me if I'm wrong or if both of you agree with me, that he also sometimes presents what is actually suboptimal as the optimal in order to negotiate on something which the other party thinks is suboptimal, but is actually optimal for Trump. And then he gets the other party to come around to what they think is suboptimal, but which is actually optimal for Trump. I mean, I hope I'm not making it confusing, but I think it's a very smart way of negotiating.
That's right. I mean, negotiation 101 teaches you that your initial bid is where you anchor, as you said, Ejaz. You anchor the negotiations. And I think that Donald Trump has done that many, many times in the past as a businessman and in his first term. What I would have expected, and I'm still waiting for this, we saw this play out a little bit with Mexico and Canada. Mexico and Canada did not cave to his demands in his first round of threats to both of them. For public consumption, they made some commitments, but many of those commitments had been made previously, or it was very hard for him to spin that as an unadulterated victory. But here's the thing. Donald Trump will spin anything as an unadulterated victory, no matter what happens, and he is aided by a media ecosystem that his supporters consume, and contrary interpretations they're not subject to those contrary interpretations. So his ability to craft a story of what he has done, this is not like operating in New York real estate in the 1980s and 90s, where there was the New York Post and the Daily News, but there was also the New York Times. So he is in a different system now that amplifies and allows him to portray all of these negotiations as a victory for him, until something is so dramatic, so contrary, that it is impossible for him to spin it that way. And to be perfectly frank, I'm kind of waiting for some country, any country at all, to respond in that way to push back on his bullying, frankly.
Great. I think that explains it very well. Mark, now what possible response, and Chris has said, and he's right, that the Europeans are closing rank, if for no other reason but for the simple fact that they need to find common ground and some common positions in order to be able to stand up to Trump, and also frankly for Europe itself. This was I'm not privy to, because I think it's still going on as we do this program, the meeting in Paris, which has been called, and so we won't know what exactly has happened in there. But do you have a sense of how this is going to pan out in terms of the European response to Trump?
Well, I think, what we need to find out, and I think I'm in agreement with the both of you here, is the flying altitude where this is going to end up. Are we on the policy level, on the paradigm level, or on the polity level? I think what we've seen with Canada and Mexico, that's the policy level, right? There are some tariffs there, and it's some money, it's some border patrols. At the end of the day, Europe is well prepared for that. It's a tit for tat kind of question. I think, whatever tariffs are going to be thrown at Europe, they're going to be responded in kind, and that's the end of it. That's not much. I think on the same level is the whole burden shifting, defense spending, how much percent of GDP. That's also really somehow already factored in. And I think that would have not caused this kind of rift that we've seen. The paradigm level is a bit more complicated. Here we talk about Ukraine. Basically throwing Ukraine under the bus, the US basically really dealing with Russia directly, leaving the Europeans out and reorienting itself towards the Indo-Pacific. That is actually already earthquake material. But as you said in your introductions, we've been talking about this for a while now, so actually no one would have been surprised by that either, even though that's a big blow. But I think what J.D. Vance said, that's polity. This is the level of international and domestic order. And he mostly spoke about domestic order. I think that where most of the outrage came. Basically, what he said is the US is going to change its domestic government system. And you, our allies, you're expected to do the same. And if you fail to do so, the value foundation of the transatlantic partnership is going to be destroyed, and therefore also the security guarantee by the United States. I mean, that's I think not that anyone has said something like that in decades, right? But there's also some stuff that he hasn't said, and that is the global level. and this is what we've been discussing for a while now, is that basically the US is no longer willing to underwrite the very order that it created and guaranteed for 80 years, which is, what they called a liberal rule-based international order. So there is like two paradigm shifts, two order shifts that are actually pursued by the Trump administration. And that's the earthquake material that Europe is not prepared for at all. Let's give me like one little glimpse into why not. The European Union is not a state. The European Union, we sometimes call it a super state, but it's not, right? It's at the end of the day, it's a couple of nation states bound together by a whole lot of treaties, right? The rule of law at the end of the day. So they're knit together by what we call a rule-based international order. Can such an entity survive in an international order that is not rule-based, but basically a dog-eat-dog world, right? And it can do so without the security guarantee by the United States is highly questionable. And that's why a lot of people actually were going even further and not only saying that, what Trump is doing is throwing Europe under the bus, but some people actually even contemplate the question that this is a direct attack on the European Union in itself, and an attempt to actually break it up, right? Because, there's been a lot of quarrels, especially when it comes to the interests of the tech oligarchs. This European commissioner basically threatening Elon Musk before the election, the European Union getting involved in the American election, that didn't go down well with the Trump team. And I think there is some payback time in that. But again, my answer to you is, when we're dealing on the policy level, it's going to be fine. Paradigm level, very, very difficult, but manageable. Order level, polity level, that's the earthquake that we're talking about.
A quick follow-up, Mark, and I would like to get Chris's take also on this very follow-up question. Is it possible that, because if you hear Vance speaking, there were these, what actually I won't even call undertones, there were these Christian overtones, especially when he was referring to abortion and, the silent prayer and the rest of it. Is it possible that he was trying to do two things? One is to sort of refer back to the MAGA crowd, which is a domestic signaling that I'm here and I'm telling the Europeans that, they need to adhere to these values. And the other is that he is looking at, and when I say he, I'm talking about Trump and Trump's entire sort of administration structure and the people he has chosen, that there is a far-right surge in Europe. As we speak, there are at least 7 states in Europe where you have far-right parties, either part of the coalition or running the governments. And so is it possible that they're trying to hedge their bets and also be ideologically wedded to it, and also hedging their bets in terms of the fact that when these far-right parties come in, they have their agendas, and therefore, instead of dealing with Europe as a collective now, why not simply reach out to various parties with whom the United States can actually do business?
Yeah, that's basically what I was hinting at. Well, if you break up the EU, if you break up the European unity, and you divide that into 27 weak small mini states, right? Mm-hmm. And you have ideological partners on the other hand, not only in those 7 states that you refer to, but maybe in some big ones. France is on the table, I think, next. Then that's a completely different ballgame. You can just basically pick the Europeans apart and get your will. It would be much easier to deal with Europe in that way, and that's why that is a major concern.
Chris?
Yeah, this is a fascinating discussion. I want to mostly second what Mark said, that there, with one exception, which is to say that yes, Europe is a federation. It is held together by treaties. They're not all weak states. Some are quite strong states, and in a position to be even stronger, who I think play a critical role in the international system. And to me, this is a test of the international system. I was always, I think it's fair to say, skeptical of the argument that the international system could only survive under the protection of a disinterested hegemon, the United States of America. The United States of America that did not act mostly in its own narrow self-interest, but instead acted in the interests of others. We have seen now, again, the second time around, the Trump administration has very little interest in that. Their interest is America first. Their interest and their message to their supporters is, when we act in the world, in the international system, we are advancing our interests. So now the question becomes, can the international system that was created by the United States chiefly, but others after coming out of World War II, can it survive a U.S. administration that is more self-interested, nakedly, narrowly, avowedly self-interested? I am not completely pessimistic that that could happen for two reasons. One is, this international order that was created does have broad benefits to many other participants. And so now is the time to see how badly they are willing to fight, hopefully not actually fight, but actually fight for its survival, to actually uphold its principles. And we had a few test cases of that in the first Trump administration. I think the best example is the free trade agreement that was being negotiated in the Asia Pacific, the TPP. When the United States withdrew from the TPP, it did not collapse. Instead, mostly with Japan in the lead, but other countries said, no, we're going to have the CTP, and it's going to continue. And the United States is welcome to join when it gets its act together, but we're not going to blow up this entire trade agreement just because the United States picked up its marbles and went home. In the present context, I want to pick up on another thing that Mark said. Yes, it is going to be the danger, I think, to European cohesion is going to be the United States trying to pick off countries one by one. But here's the thing. The United States of America is a federal system too. And there are states within the United States that, if they were countries, would be major countries in the international system. And those states are not going to be as committed as the Trump administration may be to blowing up the international order. They might agree with many of other states around the country, around the world, that this international order is worth preserving. So I think we might be seeing, within a federated system, more power devolving to sub-national groups, and with a federal system like Europe, much more coalition building, relationships that are fit for purpose, that align on certain issues but not on other issues, and much more fluidity to how these countries interact with one another. And I am even so bold to say is that I think the system that emerges from that process may actually be more resilient than the one that we presumed could only survive under the protective hand of a benevolent Uncle Sam.
That's a very interesting thought. I had this question for a follow-up question for Chris. But Mark, what do you say about what Chris has said? Because this is a very interesting point that he has raised.
Well, I hope he's right, because we're the ones being hit the most. I'm a bit more skeptical, I have to say, for two things. I mean, it's true that we already survived a couple of self-interested or not interested US governments, particularly Trump one, right? But this one seems to be a government that is openly hostile towards the liberal rule-based international order and is proactively laying the axe on it. So I think that there's much more of a push to really bring this down. And I mean, there is an ideological component behind this. This is about globalism, which is the enemy for the MAGA movement, and the whole idea that this kind of American empire is actually like a vampire sucking dry the American working and middle classes, right? So there is actually that part that is there. Also, I think what we need to look at is that this is not like an incident of a singular movement. I mean, Ejaz, you already alluded to those 7 countries in Europe, but it just seems that we are witnessing a fatigue or maybe even the erosion of liberal hegemony, not only on the global level, but also within our liberal democracies. And that just doesn't just happen overnight, but I think is the culmination of the inability for 1 or 2 decades now, I would say, of this kind of mainstream liberalism, or let's call it the really existing liberalism of the last 20 years. I don't want to get too philosophical about it, but that kind of inclination that we had seems to be incapable of dealing with any of the big issues that we're dealing with. Not with the financial crisis, not with inequality, not with financial stability, not with climate change, not with migration, and not with geopolitics. It seems to be incapable of dealing with any of the issues, right? And the issues become more and more pressing. And I think there is a populist mood that is being produced by that. And that populist mood is that, number one, people maybe not so eloquently, but some have a pretty good understanding that things cannot stay the way they are. Number two, they have an inkling, rightfully so, that they're not being told the entire truth. And number four, they have a suspicion, also legitimately, that they're going to be the ones paying the price, right? And that is the mood that is there, and that the right-wing populists, or whatever you want to call them, they're exploiting that, you know, and some of them are good at it, and some of them are not so good at it. But it's caused by the fatigue of liberalism in the center. And I think that worries me much more than a Trump government, because that you can weather. But if liberalism does not find, you know, its internal strength to revive itself, then there is a real trouble.
Would I sound very philosophical if I were to say that European Union is something that, in physical terms, is an entity that came the closest to what Immanuel Kant referred to as the Commonwealth, to have perpetual peace? I agree with the fatigue with liberalism, but the fact is that in real terms, what exactly is Trump doing? I mean, with all these tech bros, the billionaires, and so the inequality that has in many ways led to this kind of reaction is, to my mind, is going to persist. But the other issue is that, this whole idea of somehow the breakup of the European Union, and also Trump's executive directives with reference to UN mandated bodies, with reference to the ICC, is something which now actually threatens the United Nations system itself. And I'm not saying that it's a perfect system, but in so many ways, the system has allowed certain legal normative frameworks to evolve. Non-aggression, the fact that you cannot go and occupy and annex territories, and so on and so forth. So my point is that if this kind of thing, for instance, and let me ask Chris, ask you specifically. Now we know it's a difficult situation in terms of formulating a policy. There is a real situation on the ground with reference to the Donbass and certain other areas in the south that Russia has captured and occupied, and where it has also had a referendum that the world doesn't agree with. But if Russia is allowed, without any real pushback, to just keep those territories, that sets a precedent which is not particularly a healthy, or shall I say positive, precedent. We already have situations which can evolve into the whole idea of just using small annexations to send a signal but also to avoid a major war. I mean, I can give you an example. Everyone keeps talking about the Taiwan issue. Uh, Most people think that Taiwan is just one island. Taiwan is not just one island. Taiwan has, over 160 islands. I think 22 or 23 of them are populated. A few of them are very, very close to the Chinese mainland. In the 50s, right up to 1958, when there used to be regular bombardment between Taiwanese forces like the ROC forces and PRC forces, and it stopped in 1978 after PRC and the United States normalized. What could stop China, for instance, from occupying and annexing one of those outlying islands? Uh, an annexation which is very small, very significant though, but not really bringing in the United States to come and support ROC. I'm just theorizing here, speculating, because once you have set the... So are we saying that ultimately Trump is looking at this, something that Mark has, I know Mark has been talking about, so I'll take it back to Mark also, that Trump is saying, okay, we are going to, let's have spheres of influence.
So, Ejaz, I want to push back on one part of the narrative you just created, because I think it's really critical to this question going forward. If Vladimir Putin, in February of 2022, had within a few days or even weeks toppled the government in Kyiv, replaced it with a puppet government who, among its first orders of business, was renouncing any aspirations for Ukrainian membership in either the EU or NATO, had conceded, if not formal sovereignty to Russia, at least formal sovereignty to Russia over the four eastern provinces and Crimea. If those things had happened within the first few weeks of Vladimir Putin's invasion in February of 2022, then I agree with the way that you've just described it. That has not happened. What has happened is that Russia, sadly not Vladimir Putin himself, but Russia, the Russian people, have suffered grievous losses. The people of Ukraine have suffered grievous losses. But 3 years after this special military operation was unleashed, Vladimir Putin does not have even formal control of the four territories in the eastern parts of Ukraine that from 2014 till 2022 had many Russian mercenaries and little green men operating in them. So even those territories were contested from 2014 to 2022, and yet even still, he does not have control of those provinces. What I think that says, not just to Vladimir Putin himself, but to any other aspiring autocrat that would take a bite out of their neighbor, is war is fraught, war is difficult, and technology favors the defender. Now, Ukraine has also been aided by the United States of America and by Europe especially, and that aid has been critical. But I don't think that anyone, up to and including Xi Jinping, can look at this experience and say, my goodness, I can't wait to try that myself. Okay. Now, to your point about Taiwan, just one other quick response to your question. You are correct that the seizure of an offshore island, some of which, as you note, are far closer to mainland China than they are to the ROC, to Taiwan proper. But let's be clear. An amphibious operation against Taiwan would be the largest amphibious operation in human history. When the United States military in the Second World War explored the possibility of an invasion of Taiwan to dislodge the Japanese occupiers who had been occupied Taiwan since 1905, they consulted that possibility and ultimately said, that's not worth taking. It's not even worth doing it. because our prospects of success are so low relative to the cost. And I submit to you that nothing that has happened over the last 80 years changes that calculus at all, other than to make it harder to conquer an island like Taiwan than it would have been in 1944 or 1945. So for all of those reasons, I don't see the experience of Ukraine as in any way undermining the ability of the Taiwanese to resist aggression against China, with or without the United States in support.
No, I just want to, I completely agree with you. There's nothing that I disagree with what you have said. And, talking about amphibious operations just reminded me of that great film, Letters from Iwo Jima. Right. So yeah, so it's easier said than done. And you're absolutely right. In fact, when they started, that whole sort of north-south two-pronged axes towards Kyiv were actually meant to go for a blitz, get rid of the government there, and then negotiate with the West. Obviously, it's counterfactual. We also know, and Sergei Radchenko and others have written about it, the way the whole negotiation started. By end February they had started. Maybe that's the roadmap that can be looked at in terms of starting negotiations now. But my point really was that more in sort of theoretical terms, in terms of setting a norm, accepting certain things, and that kind of changes the nature of the world order. And once again, I'm the first person to accept and insist on the fact that this is not a just world order, as in a complete. I mean, it's realpolitik, it's Machtpolitik. It's it's the whole thing is about state interests. And as a structural realist, I'll be the first one to say that it can never be just. But certain norms have developed, and that is where I want to bring in Marc. So Marc, for whatever these norms were worth, and we have seen them shattered in Gaza. The fact is that these norms were there, and people protesting against whether the Russo-Ukraine war, whether the Israeli assault on Gaza, those protests were grounded in those norms. Do you fear that the disruptions are going to militate against the norms that have evolved very painstakingly and sometimes with a lot of bloodshed? Is there a possibility of those norms weakening? And if the answer is yes, then do you think we are getting into a world which I would, think is akin to Ted Hughes's Apple tragedy, where he appends the book of Genesis?
Well, I mean, I'm not the military expert here, so I'm not even going to question for a second, that the military equation on the Strait of Taiwan has not changed. But there is, of course, an asterisk, and that asterisk is with the help of the United States. And I think that's where it gets interesting, because, I mean, for a couple of years now, we had the conversation if rising powers, and by that you usually mean China, and whatever Russia is, will actually have the power to upend the American-led world order, right? But I think that right now we're in a bit of a different situation, is where actually the hegemon itself declares the order that he has created and guaranteed for 80 years for obsolete, right? And I think if we, listen to what Trump is saying over the last couple of weeks, it just sounds a lot like a different kind of posture to me, right? I mean, of course, for European ears, this whole idea of annexing Greenland and Canada and Panama and so on, it sounded like absurd, right? But it's not so absurd if you look at it through the lens of the Monroe Doctrine. If you look at it through the lens of maybe accepting spheres of influence. And maybe the US retreating within the Western Hemisphere, where it's still dominant, right? Which actually even puts the question on the table, if the US, if the Trump administration, the Trump US is actually navigating towards a posture where, you know, it accepts there is no chance to win against China militarily, and there is no chance to return to US primacy in a unipolar moment, and it actually settles within a great power coexistence and spheres of influence and sort of agreements with them, there is actually a possibility that there is a deal to be struck with China and Russia, right? And if that happens,
the spheres of influence,
then, you know, the sphere of influence is China obviously will include Taiwan, right? And for Russia, I would assume that besides Ukraine, the Caucasus is what they're going to take. So I think I'm not so worried about the ability, capability, and the power of China and Russia to militarily take something. The question that I'm asking is actually if the US has maybe changed its mind entirely and is settling for a different geopolitical posture, which then by definition would mean that we are living in a new international order.
Okay, so that brings me to my closing question, which is, we have another 4 years of Trump, minus whatever 25, 26 days gone by. Is this disruptive as it might be or is this an interregnum, sort of, you know, a bump in the road? Because the United States, as I said earlier, a long tradition of, you know, in terms of policy making, civil bureaucracy. Morton Halperin wrote that excellent book on how the bureaucracy actually develops foreign policy. So 20% of it being the presidential instinct and 80% of it being, you know, and the entire policy process, which has been upended by Trump, because everything happens in the background, implications, implementation, the, you know, talking to the allies, how they will operate or how they will react to it, and then you bring it to the table. Trump does it in reverse. He says something, and then he gets his administration to start working on it. So is this, Chris, going to be a bump in the road, or do you think there will be enough disruption? And I want to specifically mention not just externally, but internally within the federal government, for the United States to actually have a Trumpian effect lasting beyond Trump?
Look, that's a fantastic question, Ejaz. I think that we have to recognize that part of the Donald Trump phenomenon is Donald Trump. There are certain unique characteristics of him as a person, his media personality, his affect, which were extraordinarily popular, and that is how he managed to take control of one of the two major parties inside of the United States. I do not see right now another person that has those sorts of skills, that sort of affect, and so I do think it's a worthwhile question even now to assume that Donald Trump is a lame duck by virtue of the Constitution of the United States. He is a lame duck. What comes next? I think that is a valid question. But I will also say this, that Donald Trump has activated within the Republican Party, and I think within parts of just the United States generally, not just Republican partisans, a skepticism of the claim that sustained U.S. hegemony since the end of the Second World War. And that claim was that U.S. hegemony, U.S. dominance, U.S. primacy, whatever word you want to use, delivered benefit to the American people in excess of the cost that we incurred to sustain it. And I think that was always an assumption worth scrutinizing. I'm not saying it was false. I'm certainly not saying it was false in 1945 or 1955 or 1985. But I think it is a question that now has been activated in the American body politic. And if when Donald Trump leaves the scene, someone else, either Republican or Democrat, may pick up that question and present it to the American people and say, I'm going to tell you that that old model was flawed, and here's the alternative. So that's how I would answer that question.
That's a great answer. Mark?
Well, unfortunately for the rest of us, it matters a lot what happens within the domestic politics of the hegemon, right? And I think there is maybe a two-part answer that I could see. I mean, if you ask me if Trumpism survives, I think that will very much depend on the ability of Donald Trump to keep this ragtag coalition together that he has built. It's possible. I think there are common interests right now to really to upend, let's say, the infrastructure of the old order. There is common interest to change, let's say, the division of labor and distribution of what the empire actually produces. So the disruption part, I think that alliance seems to hold. But I think you don't have to be a great prophet to see that there is lots of contradictions within this alliance. I mean, we already had that public jab between Steve Bannon and Elon Musk, which basically have two fundamentally different ideas where this is supposed to go, right? And if you look at the cabinet of Trump, there's also a fundamentally different idea about fiscal politics, about economic policy, about pretty much everything. So it's going to be a rough ride. And so I'm not so sure if that will survive or not. It may not. What I'm saying is what I said before. I'm more worried about the fatigue of liberalism. I mean, there are some fundamental problems with liberalism. We saw that the neoliberal model simply cannot compete with the Chinese state capitalism. So it's more or less obsolete right now. And there have been attempts to update it, to upgrade it to something new, you know, what you call progressive neoliberalism, or what you can call Californian neoliberalism, which integrates, you know, the tech, the Silicon Valley ideology. Completely failed. You know, it failed in terms of, you know, it cannot make sense of the world. It cannot create, you know, orientation and guidance for policy making. It seems not to be able to create broad societal or electoral alliances. So it's not really working. So they failed. So that means there is a real crisis of liberalism. And as long as that crisis persists, you know, Trump may or may not succeed, but, you know, there's going to be a crisis for the liberal world order. And I think that is something that we need to discuss. And can we revive that? And, you know, when I say liberalism, I mean this in the broadest philosophical sense, right? Whatever is under this umbrella, we need to be able to explain what is happening in the world, and we need to actually come up with solutions to that and implement them and tackling the problems, or otherwise this thing is also going to be obsolete.
I agree with that. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for these insights. I think we are entering a period of Rumsfeldian unknowns. Meanwhile, the Americans have sent 6 questions to the Europeans with reference to Ukraine. And let's see how these are very specific questions. Let's see how the European side responds to those questions. And I think that we will be talking about what is coming next very soon. But for now, this is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click the subscribe button. It doesn't get me any lucre, but it'll certainly make me very happy. And it also helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.